Hello and welcome to this session about data collection best practices. In this brief lecture, we will dig deeper into step number 4, gather credible evidence. I will remind you about some best practices in data collection. Regardless of where you are in the process, I hope this helps you collect high-quality data that is relevant and trustworthy in the eyes of your stakeholders. First, before you start data collection, it is a good idea to take your instruments for a test drive. Whether qualitative or quantitative, try them out on a small group of people who are not participating in the evaluation. This step will often uncover issues that you would have only realized once data collection started. In addition to testing the instruments, try entering the data into your chosen system or database to work out any kinks before you start collecting more data. When writing or revising your instruments, be sure to use simple language. Avoid jargon and acronyms. If it helps, imagine asking these questions of a family member or friend who doesn't know anything about public health or the program you are evaluating. Be sure to define terms that may be new or unfamiliar to participants. Use smaller, simpler words whenever possible. This recommendation applies regardless of the educational level of your participants. Even people with advanced degrees will be turned off and less likely to respond to surveys or questionnaires that are written with overly complex language. Keep it simple. An important corollary, keep it simple and keep it short. When developing your instruments, avoid the temptation to keep adding questions. There may be things that would be nice to know, nice to have, but they are not truly must-haves. They're not truly relevant to your evaluation. Write these down and save them for the future. Stay focused on those things you really need to know now. The longer your instrument, whether quantitative or qualitative, the greater the burden on the participant and on you, and the lower the response rate will be. One way to maintain focus is by revisiting your evaluation questions frequently. If you feel like you are getting off track, pull up those questions, discuss them with your stakeholders, and consider whether the scope of the evaluation needs to change. Try to be flexible while not getting sidetracked. If you have a particular stakeholder that seems to be taking you off course, you can even say, "Hey, I want to be flexible, and I want to make sure I don't get sidetracked. Can we take a look at your recommendations along with the evaluation questions that we established up front and see what makes sense right now?" Another best practice, not just for program evaluation but for any project you are undertaking, is to ask for help. If you are stuck or worried about something, reach out to a classmate, faculty member, colleague, or other stakeholder. You are learning and are not expected to have all the answers. Sometimes there are other best practices you can draw from. Sometimes just talking through a challenge can help you figure out the best course of action. Finally, don't forget to stay in touch with your stakeholders. As I've said, a good evaluation is a useful evaluation. If you start to feel like the data you're collecting is not going to be useful for one reason or another, be sure to let your stakeholders know as soon as possible and ask for their help. Next, I'll mention a few common challenges to watch out for and how to address them if they arise. First, instrument problems. Once you start collecting data, you may realize there are problems with your instruments. This means your survey or your key informant or focus group guides. Perhaps the questions were written in a way that leads to different answers than you expected, meaning answers that aren't as useful or don't get at what you really meant to ask. Maybe the reading level is too advanced or the questions aren't relevant to the respondents. You might discover that the questions are too complex, or maybe they're too simple, or the key informant interview or focus group guide may be too long or not long enough. If you are administering a survey, maybe the answer choices don't make sense to the respondents. Maybe they don't understand what you are asking and are leaving things blank. If you tested your instruments in advance, you may have detected these problems before data collection began. But if not, or even if you did and these problems didn't emerge then, you may have to revise the instruments midway through. If this happens, try to keep changes to an absolute minimum, especially if you've already collected a lot of data when you discover the problem. Another common obstacle during data collection is changes to the environment. In this case, the environment could be internal. The organization or program changes midstream, or external, things happening in the community or society at large. I was part of a project once where the key personnel changed in the middle of the project. New staff were hired, and their priorities and skills were different. Ultimately, it made the evaluation team's job very tricky, because the evaluation plan was based on the original priorities and staff interests. This is the perfect example of an internal environmental change that you may have to adjust to in the course of an evaluation. External changes are common as well. So, for example, I was working with a student on a project that involved evaluating the role of social media on violence and religious extremism when there was a violent attack in the community where he was working. Ultimately, he had to change his plans because the external environment had changed so dramatically that his results would have been moot by the time he finished his project. If you are experiencing changes, whether they're internal or external, and you think they may impact your evaluation, be sure to talk to your instructor and your stakeholders. You may be able to adapt your methods, or at the very least, acknowledge the changes as a limitation in your final report. Low response rates, or having fewer participants than expected, can be frustrating for an evaluator. This is not an uncommon challenge. You have two options when faced with this situation. Work to increase the response rate, or accept a lower response rate. You may choose the latter, the lower response rate, if you are collecting qualitative data and you've reached saturation, or if you have sufficient responses for the quantitative analysis to have enough power. However, before accepting lower response rates, it is worth getting creative with recruitment. Talk to your stakeholders about your current recruitment methods and ask for their help. If you have the funding to offer incentives, even small ones like a $5 coffee shop gift card, you may be able to generate more interest. Sometimes changing your outreach method will help. If you've been emailing people, try making phone calls or texting them instead. Your exact recruitment strategy will depend on your evaluation design, but don't be afraid to revisit the plan and get creative to make sure you have enough participation to get credible results. I hope these tips have helped you plan for successful data collection or respond to the challenges in the process. If you have any questions, please reach out to your instructor. Thanks.